Hello, a very warm welcome to The Big Picture. We are live on University Radio Nottingham. I am, as always, Felix Hawes. Joining us today, we have Mark.
Hello, Felix.
Hello, Mark. Daniel.
Oh, it's great to see you again, Felix.
It's been such a long time, Daniel. And Ted.
Hello, Felix.
Hello, Ted. Thank you for coming on. As always, you can message in on the URN chat software online. So do so. We've already got a message in saying good luck to Titus completing his dissertation. Yes, good luck to Titus.
Good luck, Titus.
A dear friend and a
you.
great contributor to University Radio Nottingham and The Big Picture. Okay, so today we're talking about Turkey's election, presidential and parliamentary. We'll also be talking about houses that are being built or not being built. And we'll also be talking about changes to who can vote and the voting procedure with Jacob Rees-Mogg's recent comments regarding voter ID as well. But let's go to Turkey first of all. Now, there has been an election. For those that don't know, there is currently, the current president of Turkey is Erdogan. He is a sort of nationalist. He's anti-secularist. We've already had a message saying protect Cypriot Islands. So that already sort of shows you the sort of position that Erdogan is in with Turkey. He's also, I think it's fair to say, rolling back on certain democratic procedures, and also his position on NATO is perhaps not as strong as you'd want, and position on Russia is not what you'd also perhaps expect from a member of NATO. His main challenger, who I'm going to call by his first name Camel, because I don't want to butcher his surname, although I was practicing beforehand how to pronounce his surname. I think it is something like Kılıçdaroğlu, but I don't want to...
really?
I think so.
I would have got it very wrong then.
But we'll call him Camel. He has got the backing from across a lot of ideologies, from the communists to the Kurds to some ultranationalists. He was his main challenger, and he did well, but didn't quite manage to beat him. Erdogan won on the first round, but was 0.48% off getting that 50% needed to win on the first round. So there will be a second round. The third party candidate, who's an ultranationalist, has now been knocked out of the competition. He got about 5% of the vote. Erdogan, but of course, Erdogan's voters are... Well, I'll ask you where you think they're going to go. I'm going to go to you first, Daniel, if you don't mind. Do you think that this, as Erdogan has done so well on the first round, do you think this was the now or never moment to get rid of him, and that opportunity may have now passed? What do you think?
I mean, Erdogan has been in power in Turkey for 20 years. An astonishing long time. He's trying to build up ties to the West. I think he looked very poor, certainly in the world's eyes, after the earthquakes that happened in recent months. Housing safety made his government look quite weak. So perhaps the kind of aftermath of that meant it was a kind of unique position to replace him. But I don't know what the future of Turkey will bring to kick out Erdogan.
Okay, Ted, would you agree with that?
Yeah, I do. I mean, it might just be a case that it's one last push needed at the next election, but this really does feel like for those opponents of Erdogan, it does feel like a opportunity missed. I think the polls before the election were suggesting that his time was indeed up. It's a major blow to the West, really. I think that Erdogan looks to remain in post.
Well, that's an interesting point that you raised there, Ted, because Kemal, the main opposition, he's not exactly different to Erdogan on his position on Russia. He's also a bit neutral on the topic when you would, as a member of NATO, want your president of every, or head of state of every country to be against Russia. Also, Kemal also has quite a hard stance on Cyprus, and also has a policy of wanting to kick out many Syrian refugees and welcome Assad back onto the table as a... so he's not fully in agreement with a lot of everything that the West or NATO stands for. Mark, do you think if Erdogan does succeed, he's only going to increase his powers? It's important for the listeners to know that the presidential system that Turkey now has was put in place by Erdogan. They had a parliamentary system before, and there was a coup that occurred a few years ago, which Erdogan used to get more powers for himself. Do you think that really, with that in mind, what do you think on the question of now or never, and that time is now past?
I'm not sure. I mean, as you said, it looks to be, it was very close in the first round, and as to where those kind of remaining, third candidate eliminated votes are going to go for, I'm not sure. But I mean, someone lacking most knowledge when it comes to the kind of background, when it comes the
Wait, what?
context of Turkey. Yeah, I'm the resident. I live a bit under a rock when it comes to this sort of foreign policy. However, I find I don't know what it's going to do, but I kind of find it curious when it comes to how currently with the whole Ukraine crisis, there's quite a big focus everywhere really on NATO and the countries and what each country is contributing towards, especially when you're seeing new countries joining NATO, whether it be like Finland, I think is one of them, and I don't know, and the idea of also welcoming back Assad into the I don't know how to describe it, but the not negotiate, but the kind of whole diplomacy thing, welcoming back after being in pretty much exile from that the past few years, which there was a news story about recently. I saw I think just this morning.
It's back in the Arab League.
Yes. And things like that I can't see being particularly popular in the NATO sphere. But if the other contender isn't particularly offering much difference, then I don't know what, I think probably people are just going to end up opting for the status quo, aren't they?
Well, there's not much difference on the foreign policy point of view, but one of the key differences for Turkish people is that Kemal is not anti-secular. So that we've had situations where a lot of museums have been turned into mosques by Erdogan, and he's bringing in a lot of religious fundamentalism to Turkey. You mentioned Finland there, Mark. That raises a good question. So Finland and Sweden both applied to join NATO. Finland now has. Sweden hasn't because of Turkey blocking its entry because of disagreements over Sweden's views on some Kurdish groups.
I wasn't aware of that, actually.
So it is Turkey that is blocking Sweden. So my question to the panel is this. Do you think, with that in mind, with Sweden being perhaps more in line with NATO's policy, that actually it might be better to kick Turkey out to accept Sweden in? Or do you think, as Sweden is going to align with the NATO anyway, regardless of it being in it or not, that it's better to keep Turkey in the tent than not? Because if you kick Turkey out, then maybe it's just going to go fully pro-Russia, when at the moment it is a bit more neutral. Daniel?
I mean, I always thought it was a little bit bizarre and odd that Turkey was in NATO, and we heard earlier, of course, from someone who wrote in and was worried about the state of the Cypriot Islands. I imagine that was probably Inushka or someone similar. So that I think it is a bit odd that NATO's kind of had the position of let's just get in as many people as possible, so long as it's not Russia or China, and therefore we'll put our influence on them. And it appears as though actually, in the case of Turkey, that's not particularly working, but it would create a bit of a volatile situation, to use a very vague phrase.
Problematic,
which is of course a phrase that our listeners hate due to its lack of meaning. But it would create a difficult situation. I think if Turkey was kicked out, it might as well, in the short term, be better to keep them in. But there you go. There's my thoughts on it.
Ted, same question to you.
Yeah, well, it's important to remember that if my memory serves me correctly, Turkey was actually a founding member of NATO. It's not just a country that's joined at some stage in the late 20th century or in the 21st century, but it's been in NATO certainly since very near the start, if not founding member. And yeah, it would be. It depends how Turkey continues to act as a country that isn't a true friend of the West. If it's going to go down the line of just constantly antagonising the rest of NATO, then in that instance there'd be very little point keeping them in and holding us back. But I think at the moment, certainly, and I can't see it changing, it would be very foolish to kick Turkey out of NATO. You would just end up pushing them firmly into an alliance with Russia. And as you said, Felix, Sweden is slightly less likely to be attacked by Russia than Finland. I think it's very successful that we've got Finland into NATO. I'd like to see Sweden in NATO, of course I would. But I think we can rely on a strong alliance to continue with Sweden, regardless of whether they join NATO.
Why do you want to see Sweden in NATO?
What do I want to see? I want to see as many countries in that are deemed to be in the West as part of NATO. I think we want to protect Sweden from Russian aggression. Anything which limits Russian aggression. It's any country that wants to join NATO sees itself as being a Western power and wants the mutual security of NATO should join. Obviously, in the case of Ukraine, that's a little more difficult because you're throwing the West into an existing war. But the extent to which we can preempt potential future Russian aggression by allowing countries with borders and close to Russia to join NATO, I think that'd be a good thing.
Mark, what do you think?
I think, the previous panelists have mentioned this. It's tricky because I remember reading that Turkey contribute quite a few soldiers to NATO's forces, and obviously that's not something that you would choose to get rid of willy-nilly. Also, it's mentioned in the article about the election that they're kind of quite key, quite interesting in the fact that they like to have quite good democratic relations with not only the West but also, extending, hands to the East as well, and when it comes to talking to leaders like Chinese and people like that, and I think having countries like that in NATO is something that is perhaps something that isn't necessarily all bad, because whilst it's a military alliance, it's good to have some amount of some amount of friendliness, or like a few members to kind of dilute that more hardline stance, because then you can it's less when Russia sees and other nations see the standard West rogues gallery in their eyes, then it's quite easy to have a go at them. Whereas having the odd contender that's a bit more on friendly terms with them can be of help in some cases. And obviously, just the repercussions of getting rid of someone from NATO, it would seem a little complicated. But as for wanting Sweden to join, I think that's a good thing. I think kind of more countries to kind of be involved and to act as a strong force against Putin's aggression, as well as other problematic states, then that's a positive as well. But aside from that, I'm not really sure.
Thank you, Mark. We've had another comment about Cyprus. Cyprus needs to join NATO. Well, this does. I did mention Turkey's stance on Cyprus. Of course, depending on your point of view, but I think the person messaging in would see it from this perspective, that Turkey is currently occupying the north of Cyprus. So, in that regard, where do we stand, if we have an opinion at all as a panel, on that situation regarding Cyprus and Turkey being there in the north? What do we think? Does anyone? I don't want to put anyone.
I'll
go on, Ted.
Well, for that to happen with Turkey being a member of NATO, you're looking at needing a peace settlement between Cyprus and Turkey and Greece, actually. I don't know what that resolution will look like. I know that negotiations have been going on for a long time, but if that was something that was ever a possibility, you can't have two members of NATO which are in such disagreement and recognition of territory disputes as that. That would be the main obstacle.
That's what the UN is for.
Well, yes, but I'm not saying you pursue that settlement through NATO. I'm saying that settlement would need to be reached in order to allow Cyprus to join NATO. That's just simply how it would have to be.
It would be a bit of an awkward situation if Article 5 was triggered by a member state against another member state. Yes. Article 5 being, for the listeners that don't know, the policy where if one nation, one state in NATO is attacked, then all countries are attacked. It's only been invoked once, which was after the 9/11 attacks against the US. We've had some more comments. I thought Turkey was imminently joining the EU. Was that another Brexiteer lie has come in? We've also had NATO is a capitalist plot, Sarah, famous panellist of The Big Picture, would say. And we have, of course, also had a comment about, can we have a shout out for Ella Vardy? Of course we can. Ella is one of our most passionate and loyal listeners. So thank you, Ella, always for listening, because I know you will be. Right, we're going to take a break now. And if Erdogan does win, then it is possible that he will just have all the power. In fact, the winner will take it all.
This is Greg James, and you're listening to University Radio Nottingham, otherwise known as URN, or EARN if you get it wrong. Go well!
Hello, a very warm welcome back to The Big Picture. I am, as I was before, Felix Hawes. We've had a message saying, great song choice from Michelle Fannon. Thank you very much for listening.
Mum.
Also, someone else has said the Meryl Streep version is much better. I think that might be Mr. Duffy, because we have spoken about our love for the Mamma Mia musical, which is very good. And do enjoy Mamma Mia at the musical. The experience in the O2 Arena. Of course, other musicals are available. Okay, our next topic is housing. So this has come up in conversation recently because Starmer has announced that he would allow some building on the Green Belt. Now, the Green Belt, I think, might have a name that suggests that it is a large green area. It's not necessarily the case. Fabian Polling actually discovered that there's a lot of misinterpretation of that. 46% say that you should never build on the Green Belt when asked that question. But when what the Green Belt is described in more neutral terms, only 29% said you shouldn't ever build on it. So there does seem to be some discrepancy there. Okay, do we actually have any NIMBYs? Mark, you are a Lib Dem, but you don't actually agree with the Lib Dem policy. You're not. You're more Bob the Builder, not Bob the Blocker. What's your take on housing here?
Well, I mean, first of all, when it comes to Lib Dem's stance on this kind of stuff, I think, as with any political party's stance with this kind of stuff, there's so much variation with it, especially from local council to local council. It's really weird and it's inconsistent and it's a big pain in the backside. My opinion on it is very much from a YIMBY perspective. And yeah, house building's great. I'm happy to say I'm a Bob the Builder fan. It was one of my favourite shows as a kid.
Has it influenced your ideas, do you think?
But Bob the Builder, yeah. Well, there was a film, Bob the Builder, like renovating a castle, and it was very good. It was very lovely. Yeah, ever since then I've just been it's been the past couple of years, honestly, to be honest. As I've got mostly my YIMBYism has come from whilst I'm sort of know people from rural areas and live in a sort of in an area where there's quite a bit of green belt near us. Is mostly in reaction to just the skyrocketing house prices and the increasing realisation that home ownership for our generation is becoming more and more of a fantasy, and that makes me angry. So
property owning democracy. Ted, what's your views on this?
Well, this week I have to say I think it's been the time where I have most agreed with a Labour Party policy and disagreed with a Conservative Party policy. To quote Tom Harwood, just build it, just do it, I don't care. It is a damning indictment of this country that how hard it is. I mean, we're not the only country, admittedly, but a damning indictment of how hard it is for young people to get on the property ladder. This green belt, as you touched on, Felix, what the green belt actually looks like, it isn't our lovely countryside, our green and pleasant land. It is often just wasteland, and there is no reason at all why houses shouldn't be built there. And I'm sick to death of people in massive mansions in this country coming up with reasons why their lovely landscape shouldn't have houses built on. There is a major supply crisis. Back in the 1930s, we were building 300,000 homes a year. Okay, admittedly, a lot of it then came after that, the 40s, where there was also a lot of building. This was to do with replacing buildings that were that were destroyed during the Blitz. But we were building 300,000 houses a year in the 40s and 50s. We are now building 200,000 a year. With the increase in population that we are experiencing, it is outrageous that we are not building as many houses as we used to. There needs to be a serious deregulation attempt made by government, and I'm disgusted that the Conservative Party is not prepared to do anything about the housing crisis.
Daniel, do you think that Labour are actually now more of a pro-growth party than the Conservatives?
I mean, perhaps on housing, but the Conservatives are so mixed on it, I don't really think they know what to believe. The kind of slightly bizarre thing is that if you look in polling, it kind of suggests, yes, people want houses to be cheaper. Of course they do. They're vastly overpriced. But at the same time, they do want houses to be built where they are, and so you're stuck in an impossible situation where we are, where political parties don't know how to respond to polling. And of course, the right thing to do is to just say, screw it, we need to build it, which is exactly what Ted said. It's interesting, this week, I believe, perhaps next week, the immigration figures will come out, and they will say that net Britain will have nearly 1 million people come into the country. That's not even total number coming in, that's the total number coming in minus the amount left. If you have 1 million people coming into the country and you only build about 200,000 houses, it's quite simply not enough when you've already got a housing shortage. France, on the other hand, had a net immigration rate of about 170,000 last year. So the last Prime Minister to have built over 200,000 houses in a year was Tony Blair, 204,000. Under Thatcher it was 215,000. So it's been hardly enough for decades now. And so I think you need to get people on the housing ladder. It will make rent more affordable as well if houses are cheaper. So build in the green belt. It's an obvious solution, but that's not the only reason why not enough houses are being built.
Polling has actually indicated what we've actually seen on this panel today, that this actually is a very cross-party divide, as you've got voters on all parties disagreeing on this. We've got Mark, who's a Lib Dem, Daniel and Ted, that are Conservatives here, agreeing on this, and there might be another person in the room that's more of an NIMBY, but we'll never know because the host is impartial.
This is when this is when we get some snarky Labour comment in the chat making a joke about Conservatives and Lib Dems working together. So to one Ben Duffy, who is writing this as we speak.
Yellow Tories. Well, we have got a comment in. Lib Dems should all be Yimbys because they can only vote Lib Dem from their second homes. Going from that and Daniel's point about immigration, I'm going to raise a point to both your Lib Demmer and your Tories in some of these arguments. So I'll mention the overall theme first and then I'll go to you both. So Mark, obviously with houses, you've got the immigration point that Daniel pointed out. You've also got, with a higher rate of divorce, you're going to have two houses there. You've got students living in multiple places as well. That adds a lot of pressure. Do we need to reform the uni system? To the more conservatives, think from you, is this not just the end point of capitalism or a continuation of capitalism, with also a lot of second homes being purchased, which obviously is a Lib Dem trait as well, but also about
hey, come on.
A lot of flats being being purchased just for capital, and no one's actually living in them. That's quite common. Obviously, that's not the case in most places, but that does happen. So I want to know what you think on that. But I'll go to you first, Mark.
Well, I think just generally we have to kind of rethink our approach to housing. It's like obviously the student issue is I think something we've explored on Wednesday Pulse before, and is definitely a tricky one. But a lot of student houses is, you know, you're doing there's a lot of cohabitation. But I think another issue that we have in the UK is that there's very much this kind of fantasy, or like kind of wish, this dream to like have a nice like, I don't know, nice house with a big garden, la di da di da. Whereas not really that much appetite for how, for instance, places in Europe like France do it, for like, you know, nice, fancy, cute city apartment type living, which is obviously a lot more efficient at actually housing people, and can be quite nice. I think in the UK currently, people just associate such house building techniques with you know, not very well built council flats and the like, which is a bit of a problem. I mean, are there any? And when it comes to second homes, obviously, it's probably best to address that, considering the multiple second home based gags that I've been the brunt of so far on the show. I think we also have to really reapproach our attitude on second homes as well, because especially in your coastal areas, your places like your Devon and your Cornwall and elsewhere, especially in the southwest. It's so difficult to get on the housing ladder, primarily because there's so many empty houses being used as second homes, and thus the no extra building just pushes the prices higher and higher and higher. And then what do you get? You get lots of young people who are being brought up in those areas who then move out elsewhere, who create demand elsewhere, and then the problem just gets worse and worse and worse. So yeah, that's generally my distilled opinions on it, unless you have any other questions.
I might come back to you, Mark, but I'll go to Daniel and Ted. What do you think to the situation?
Yeah, it's a complicated one. I think people must have the right to buy second homes. I am broadly in favour of making it harder for foreign nationals to buy homes in the United Kingdom as an investment, particularly Chinese investors. I just don't see how that's of any benefit to British people. But I do think it's important that we do become a property owning democracy. I disagree with Mark on that. If people own their own home, then they treat their own home differently. They'll buy their own door. They'll work to try and buy an extension or whatever it is. Make their house as good as possible. If you're renting, it's just you don't have the same relationship to your house. But it's a complicated one. I know people have suggested things like increasing council tax on houses that aren't built enough, or perhaps don't have residents in it. There's ways of incentivising people to move into housing, but it's a very complicated problem. I don't say I have all the answers, but certainly France does, because they don't have a housing crisis. So one to look at across the pond, I reckon. The smaller pond.
Rare to say that from you, perhaps Daniel, that France have done something better, or maybe not. Maybe I misread you, Ted.
Yeah, you mentioned there about this being the result of late stage capitalism. I have to completely disagree with that notion.
That's absolutely fine.
This is the result of late stage regulation. If we increase the level of supply, that's what it comes down to. In a free market, we don't have these issues. We need to increase supply. It all comes back to supply. Second homes are not an issue if we have the necessary supply to house people in this country. That's where the issue is with second homes. People have a right to own a second home, and there would be no issue if we would just build. And yeah, I think we do have to look across the pond to France. I mean, again though, France is just less densely populated than the UK. We've got pretty much a similar size population, but France.
Well, NIMBYs have a lot less power in France.
Yeah.
You just don't have the same rights in France to stop construction. Very famously, the Eurostar from Paris to Calais was built in a matter of a few years, I think, but then from Dover to London, it took absolutely ages. The train for years went at ordinary train pace because they couldn't build the tracks nearly as fast because it was much more power to block it in the United Kingdom.
How can you ruin our green and pleasant land? We've had a comment saying that, and also the Tory party will always govern in the interests of the party, not the interests of the country. Estate tax should be near 100% for houses over 500,000. There is a stupid number of pensioners living in 3-bed houses in central London. Talking about renting, you may not have read this, but there was recently a proposal from the government about ending no-fault evictions. What do you think to that?
That's good. It's protecting the rights of tenants, and I think a lot of the problems with housing in this country, like more deeply, do stem from this sort of landlord culture that we seem to have baked ourselves into. I mean, going back to it, if one of the reasons that we're in this housing crisis, not only is it because of the inability to build new stuff to match the increasing demand, but you've also had the absolute the absolute mess that was the right to buy scheme, where you saw loads and loads of homes being bought cheaply after they're being rented, and then which was essentially government subsidised, and then being used as places to privately rent out to tenants. So I think getting rid of no-fault evictions is definitely a positive step forward. I think previously Daniel, misunderstood what I said when I was talking about home ownership and things like that. I think definitely home ownership is a good thing. But as I said, I think it's one of those things where you need sort of continued, and I think Ted was sort of in minor agreement here. You need to have that sort of continued supply, because currently there's no supply. Currently there's just incentivization of demand, and you fast forward to another 10 years time, and if you don't continue to build, you'll just end up in the same problem that we currently are. If that makes sense.
Yes. Thanks, Mark. Daniel or Ted?
I don't know the intricacies of the no fault eviction law, but I tend to be skeptical of these ideas. Socialists, I don't necessarily say it's socialist policy, but socialists will come up with ideas like, let's just do a rent freeze, ban the increase of renting going any higher in properties, and that, on the surface level, what a fantastic idea, but it just prevents landlords caring about their properties anymore. And
landlords care about their properties currently? Wow.
You do, because they need people to rent it. I mean, my landlord had to make sure the property was clean. He did a complete refurbishment before I moved in.
The thing is,
gave us a good deal for the fact that we treated the house well after our first year. So it does matter, but you'd ultimately actually secede power from the renters and give it to the government But anyway, I'm just sceptical of it.
Ted?
Yeah, it's interesting that Daniel's mentioned the idea of rent freezes, because that is also a proposal that's come back the past week from the government. Again, I can't believe that a Conservative Party is putting forward these proposals.
Is it Conservative? Question mark?
Of course, it's not. It's a moronic.
That's
policy.
another topic we could debate on the picture in a future days.
It's a moronic policy. I mean, it's going back to your actual question about the no-fault evictions. That as a broad idea. Yeah, that's okay. I'm not sure the intricacies of it. I'm not sure whether that includes landlords wanting to then sell the property, because that is a reserved right of the landlord. But rent controls, they are such a childish idea. Why don't we just stop the rent rising? It'll lead to landlords, as Daniel said, not caring about the property or just pulling out of the market. And whether you like landlords or not, we need landlords to a certain extent in this country. We need people to be able to rent. I know we've talked a lot about people. We want a house owning democracy, but there will always be a need for a rental sector, and to disincentivise that is stupid.
Well, thank you very much. We're going to take a very short musical break now. We heard from Mark that he is Bob the Builder, not Bob the Blocker. So let's enjoy an old theme tune.
This is URN.
Hello, welcome back to The Big Picture. That was a very short musical break, but we are now on our third and final topic of today's show, which is on all this voting. Who can vote and current voting procedures.
I love voting.
We'll stick with this. Yes, good. Mark says he likes voting, and do vote, everybody, when there is the next election. I'm sure all our listeners were avidly at the polling stations at the local elections. Now, did you remember your voter ID? Because that was used for the first time in our local elections that happened recently. A figure has come out to suggest about 0.2% of voters who were turned away and didn't return to vote. So it did affect a small number, smaller than was perhaps estimated, but that's still 0.2% of the population that otherwise would have voted. And potentially that 0.2% is higher than the number of cases of fraud that might have come out before, but that's something we can discuss. But the key comment that's come out recently is Jacob Rees-Mogg, who seemed to suggest, not outwardly, but seemed to suggest that this was an attempt of gerrymandering by the Conservative Party, and he said that it sort of backfired because most people that forgot their IDs were old people that tended to vote Conservative anyway. Ted, I'll start with you. What do you think to voter IDs? Is this or was this an attempt by the government to gerrymander? And do you think actually that it is the sort of right thing to do it in principle anyway?
Well, it's hard to say. I certainly didn't believe prior to Jacob Rees-Mogg's comments that it was an attempt by the government to gerrymander. And again, I think it's logical to expect that it would be older people that wouldn't have the necessary ID. Aside from all that, I'm hugely in favour of voter ID. I really think for the most part it is a non-issue. It was easy to get voter ID. It was well advertised. The surveys before the law came in suggested that the vast majority of people already had voter ID. Those that didn't could apply for a free voter authentication certificate. If you didn't get round to sorting that out, or you were somehow living under a rock and didn't know that you needed it, then I'm sorry, that is your fault, and I personally do not care that you were not able to vote. It was so well advertised.
We've had a comment saying ID is a woke invention designed to exert government control over freedom-loving Brits. Slippery Sunak is not to be trusted.
Well, that's just made up. It's just not true.
Titus.
I wonder who that was.
That is presented without evidence can be dismissed without evidence. It's just nonsense.
We've also had a comment saying, and we will get into Labour's positions soon because this refers to it, of both Conservative and Labour appear to be playing party politics as per usual. I think voter ID is good in principle but was executed poorly. As was implied last week, the Tories aim to use the ID to gain more votes from older Conservative voters. Now I think Labour is trying to do the same by giving the vote to younger voters more likely to be left-wing. Maybe instead of trying to force the voting system in their favour, the party should be focusing on policies that people will actually want to vote for. We'll get into Labour later on. But I want to go to you, Daniel. What do you think to voter ID?
Yeah, it's quite interesting. I actually think one of the most interesting things is that in the United States of America, voter ID is an absolutely massive political issue, whether it's morally right to ask people to produce IDs, particularly amongst the black community there. Whereas here, it's actually the biggest fuss has been whether it's helped the Conservative Party or not. I mean, who cares? To be honest with you, it's about whether the policy is right or wrong in the first place. Right. And actually, I am suspicious of the fact that without voter IDs, you can essentially claim to be anyone. You could claim to be your neighbour and vote as your neighbour. And I do
because that's happened so many times before, hasn't it, Daniel?
Well,
that's not relevant.
It does happen. It has happened, and there have been a few somewhat dodgy elections that have happened in recent years, by-elections. They didn't have much national importance, but yeah, I don't really see a problem. As Ted said, it was very well explored, and the real problem was the fact that so few people voted in the local elections anyway. I mean, look at Lenton and Woollerton East. To give a good case study, student area, lots of young people. And a turnout of less than 20%. It's utterly absurd, isn't it? The lack of interest. I mean, that should be the real. If I was to say, Felix, I mean, a very poor choice of topic. Really, we should be discussing why was turnout so low to even care about local elections or local issues, rather than whether it was right to hand in your ID.
Mark.
Well, voter ID as a concept was unnecessary. It was unneeded. It was stupid. It was a waste of time. The whole idea of it's not that tricky to actually get one. That's not the point. What did it bring us? Protection from a crime that there's been I think 3 convictions of voter fraud over, any recent history when it comes to UK electoral politics. The paper-based system that we have here when it comes to voting makes proper electoral fraud it makes it pretty much near impossible to do it because it's all done on pen and paper that would actually make any difference. And I will guarantee that certainly that the difference when it comes to skewing votes that turning away voters will probably do more damage to democracy than the odd made-up person potentially voting as their neighbour. I mean, what advantage does it really bring them? It doesn't really make sense. And I mean, as to what Jacob Rees-Mogg said, first of all, it's quite hilarious. Nobody seems to know what gerrymandering is. There's not gerrymandering, Mr. Rees-Mogg. Gerrymandering is, redrawing districts, but whatever, that's the pedant in me. I find it quite funny that they found it to have backfired. I mean, from the start, not only was it the idea that it would discriminate against people from ethnic minority backgrounds, young people, trans people that might not have access to proper ID. Not only were those risks that were explored, it was exactly that. It was kind of the prevention of the elderly from voting. As Rees-Mogg seems to have said, it's backfired in that sense. But quite funny to think for him to pretend that it wasn't already warned that might happen. I think with voter ID, it's just one of those things. It was a stupid move that seems to be quite an opportunistic way of doing politics.
How was it opportunistic?
Because it's just that it was quite clearly an attempt by the incumbent government to get to prevent people less likely to vote from them voting in the first place. There's no other reason. If they would, knew what they were doing, which let's, for the benefit of the doubt, assume that they did, although that's a bit of a reach now. They would know that it's voter fraud is a non-issue here. So why else would they bring it in? There's no sensible reason why they would otherwise.
With only a 0.2% turn decrease in people voting, is that actually enough to have made a difference to an election either way?
I think it's tricky. I think 0.2% of the electorate, I can't do the maths in my head right now, but it's about which often the areas I feel there's definitely going to be some amount of class divide in it, and therefore I'm going to say probably it's sensible to assume that some areas and local authorities where perhaps income is lower would be more badly affected than others, and especially in locals where especially with such low turnouts, the margin in terms of votes between one person winning and one person not is fairly small, and I think it would be quite unwise to suggest who cares, 0.2%. I think the fact that we're losing voters full stop is a bad thing, especially since Daniel seems so passionate about the fact that turnout was so low. The idea of turning away more voters seems like a counterproductive way to deal with that.
We're going to move on to Labour's policy. So it's been, I think it was leaked. It's not been announced, but that Labour are suggesting that 16. God save the King message has just come through. Indeed. 16 and 17-year-olds should get the right to vote. Obviously, that's been mooted about for quite a long time. It should be noted that most countries in the democratic world, 18 is the age you can vote. But also EU citizens, which is interesting because in the EU, it is, I believe, EU law that you can't vote in other people's in the countries that you're not a citizen of. So it would be ironic if that got introduced here. What do we make to this? I'm going to go to Ted first.
Okay, to start with, the idea of giving 16, 17-year-olds the vote, it's one I'm against, I have my reasons for, but it's an understandable policy. It's not that outrageous. I think there's more of an issue that we have in this country. We're not the only country. We have an issue where you can do things at different ages. You know, the point at which you become an adult it isn't obvious. I like 18. I think it makes sense. It's the age you can drink, etc. But I'm not going to lose sleep over 16-year-olds being allowed to vote. The idea, though, that EU citizens should be voting in our elections is outrageous. And even for Labour Party standards, I cannot believe it is an idea they're proposing. One of the rights of being a citizen is that you get the vote. I don't care how long somebody from the EU has been living in this country. They should not have the right to vote. If they've been living here and they want to vote, they should become a citizen of the United Kingdom. We're not in the EU. Even if we were, they shouldn't be allowed to vote. We're not in the EU. It's against EU law for citizens of another country to be able to vote. You know, you want to talk about screaming attempts to change the electorate to favour your party. It is an outrageous policy, and I really hope I really hope that the Labour Party don't go through with it. I'm sure Keir Starmer will change his mind next week, so we won't have to worry about it.
So but flaky, as has been.
It attacks the idea of what it means to be a citizen, what it means to be British. You know, you're just starting down a slippery slope of eradication of the nationality. Why on earth should somebody who doesn't care enough about this country to become a citizen have the right to determine what happens in this country? It's ridiculous.
Mark, what do you think? What do you think to this?
Well, as far as 16, 17-year-olds being given the right to vote, it's something that I certainly agree with. It's something I certainly would have agreed with when I was 16 or 17. When it comes to, I think, a lot of the big issues that people worry about when it comes to 16, 17-year-olds voting is, they don't know what they're talking about. Well, chances are, when you look at generally the demographics of voting when it comes to young people, so 18 to 25, generally if people aren't that interested in it, they just won't vote. So the idea that you're just going to have introduced a load of people who don't know what they're doing into the electorate and is going to ruin the results is quite frankly a stupid one.
Should we have universal suffrage then for all children?
Well, no, I'm not saying that. However, obviously, as you mentioned, it's in this country we have a bit of an issue with trying to work out, when certain rights start and whatever else. So obviously, age of consent 16, the ability to drive is 17, and then there's other stuff at 18 and whatever. I mean, at least we're not the US and make people drink at 21. Yeah. So there's a bit of an issue there. I mean, but other nations of the UK seem to be doing it, and there's been no substantial difference in how electoral politics work on that level. And also the idea that there's plenty. I've come across plenty of people that are older that seem to have got much less clue of what's going on than most 16 and 17-year-olds. So it's not something that I'm worrying about either. And that I know a fair share of sort of people of adult age that I'm slightly concerned that they've got the right to vote. But who cares? That's how it works. When it comes to EU citizens, I really don't know enough about that. I'd be surprised if it was a genuine policy. These leaks can generally be a bit misconstrued. I found Ted's comment quite amusing about Keir Starmer changing his mind, though. That was quite funny and probably right if that was indeed a policy that I don't see it being. I don't see where that would come from, though, because if you've seen how Keir Starmer pivoted when it comes to freedom of movement post Brexit and other rights of people, it generally wouldn't fit in with his kind of idea model of no, let's keep closed borders, X, Y, Z. But I also find it quite hilarious of the response to the idea of giving EU members the right to vote, saying that it's a political party attempting to change the electorate to suit them, which is somewhat ironic considering where the previous conversation ended when it came to voter ID. But those are my thoughts on it, Felix. Yeah, 16, 17-year-olds, go on, go and vote for us. More Lib Dem voters. Okay.
Number 3, yeah.
As you know, Lib Dems are very well known for our outreach amongst the young. So, that sounded bad though. Whatever.
Yes, that's where there's the Liberal Democrat Society, of course, doesn't exist because the last president, defected to the Conservatives here.
What a legend.
Mark, is this an attempt by Labour, before I go to you, Daniel, to change the system to benefit them? Because, let's be honest, what do we think 16 and 17-year-olds are going to be voting? They're not going to be voting, well, maybe a few
the thing is,
Dems in there, as you say, but...
I don't know. I think on principle, regardless of who was doing it, I'd support it. And I think you can just as easily say the same about the 18 to 25 demographic. Yet, if you look at the voting in that particular area, they're not going out and voting Labour in droves either. So, the idea that if you lower the age by 2 years, it's going to all of a sudden cause a massive landslide of people voting for Labour seems a little far-fetched. As for EU citizens, as I said, I don't know. I'm taking that leak with a pinch of salt. I can imagine it would probably benefit Labour in that sense, but as I said, I don't think it's a particularly serious proposal at this point. So I couldn't really care that much at this point.
Thank you, Mark. Daniel, you supported Brexit, if you don't mind me saying.
I am shocked, I tell you.
Obviously it's discriminatory to just offer it to EU citizens. Should the whole world, everybody, get a right to vote in our elections? What do you think to this whole question?
Well, it's interesting that you've decided to phrase it like that. I think the fundamental thing to say is that yes, voting is discriminatory. It is one of the most important things actually that you can do as a citizen. This is why we are so outraged that so few people bothered to vote in the local elections. It shows a lack of interest in a very important action that you should take as a citizen. It's why, by the way, I don't favour lowering the voting age to 16-year-olds, because I think you're belittling the importance of voting if you say that actually people who are legally children should be able to vote. I don't think 16-year-olds, who have people who haven't even done their GCSEs, for goodness sake, should be able to vote. I mean, why I, as an 18-year-old who'd not even done his A-level, should be able to vote. I mean, even now, I've not, barely finished my degree. Whether I should be able to vote is really quite astonishing. And just broaden the franchise. It's insane. It is one of the most important parts of our history. And now to say, give it to people who are EU citizens, they have no affiliation to the country. They have no interest in furthering British interest. This, democracy is one of the core parts of British history that we've got, this proud system, and just say anyone can have it, just as long as you're part of the EU. As Ted said so brilliantly earlier, it really waters down what it means to be British. And the most ironic part of this is that the red wall that Keir Starmer needs to win back are precisely the type of people who will be most opposed to this, because they understand that there is something called being British, and if you just open it up to anyone, then yes, you water down what it means to be a part of this country.
Well, thank you very much. I think
Meghan Markle having the right to vote in the UK would be a particularly good thing. If we give it to everybody.
As a member of the royal family, it is convention, though not the law, that you can't vote.
I don't think the Queen's allowed full stop, but I think the King. That's true.
Probably will be voting for Biden. That's obviously that's a joke. That is a joke. That is a joke. I am impartial.
I'm glad we're ending this on Daniel's plea for the right to vote to be taken away from him, though.
Okay, we're going to wrap it up there. Thank you to Mark, to Ted, and to Daniel for coming on today.
Thank you very much.
For listening.
And to Ella for listening, and to all our regular listeners.
Not Ben.
And for Daniel.
Not Ben Duffy, yeah.
And for Ben for briefing me what to say before I came on.
Ben Duffy wants to talk. Wants to hear about Northern Ireland local elections.
Coalition
but
of chaos.
we will hear that. We'll talk about Northern Ireland local elections maybe next week. All right. Thank you. Cheerio. Goodbye.